As Seoul engaged in defense talks here with Washington and economic talks in San Francisco with APAC partners, Pyongyang played host to a Russian delegation last week. So what was the gist of the latest meeting between North Korea and Russia across the border? And why do some pundits believe collaboration between North Korea and Russia may be a cause of some concern for China? Also, what is the latest regarding the reported fresh advances in North Korea's banned ballistic missile program? Hope your work week is off to a good start. You're watching Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we touch upon the various diplomatic engagements here on the Peninsula and beyond over the past week. For this, I have Thomas Maresca with me in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I also have Malene Jensen with us. Malene, it's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
Right, Thomas, there was a flurry of diplomatic engagements here on the Peninsula and beyond, over in the US, that is. But let's begin here on the Korean Peninsula. I believe a Russian delegation visited Pyongyang last week. It was led by its Natural Resources Minister. Could you tell us a bit more about that particular visit?
Yes, so led by Natural Resources Minister Alexander Kozlov last week. Not a ton of details come out of these meetings. I mean, it's coming on the heels of just a lot of, a burgeoning, deepening relationship between Russia and North Korea. This particular meeting, the North Korean state media basically said they were discussing technology, science, economic cooperation. They sort of praised Kozlov and Russia for, they quoted Kozlov as praising Russia for sort of supporting praising North Korea for supporting Russia in all of its, regional and international goals. TASS, the Russian news agency, did report that Kozlov said that Russia may start sending supplies of meat to North Korea early next year, and also said that at the meeting they discussed cooperating on exploration for rare earth minerals, offshore oil drilling, and hydrocarbons. So, in some ways, that's some of the first sort of specific things we've seen from, the deliverables from this Russia and North Korea partnership. But obviously, it's coming in the context of, growing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. And, Washington and Seoul have said many times that North Korea is already supplying arms and artillery to Russia for its war in the Ukraine. And there's been some questions about what exactly is North Korea getting in return from Russia, and there's been a lot of talk about technical support for military ambitions, including launching of a spy satellite that they've announced they've planned to do. They haven't done it yet, there's also some growing concern that Russia may be helping out with their nuclear ambitions. Secretary of State Antony Blinken mentioned that possibility when he was here last week. So I think those are some of the things that people are keeping an eye on, and this just comes in the wake of several of these diplomatic engagements between Russia and North Korea.
Right, indeed. And Malene, this particular trip by the Russian delegation also comes amid news of fresh advances in North Korea's banned ballistic missile program. Could you tell us a bit more about these particular advances and perhaps also their broader concerning implications?
Yes. So according to the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he's concerned that China and Russia are both helping North Korea developing and strengthen its military. And the thing is, right now, the U.S. have sanctions against North Korea, both regarding the missile program and their nuclear program. So if it's true that China and Russia are helping North Korea, they are actually helping North Korea violating sanctions against the country. This spy satellite that Thomas was also mentioning, it is, Seoul is, the Seoul National Intelligence Agency, they have been claiming that Russia might help North Korea in making this spy satellite, which then would be a breach with the U.S. Sanctions against the country. However, right now, we're not sure. We know that North Korea is at the final stage of launching a new missile, but we don't know how far they are, and it has not been confirmed whether Russia has actually helped North Korea.
Right, and staying with this, Thomas, as you mentioned as well, this growing collaboration between North Korea and Russia, some pundits claim may be a source of some concern for neighboring China as well. What
Thomas, do they mean, and what are your thoughts on this?
Right. Well, there was an article recently or last week in the Diplomat that sort of talked about this, which was kind of breaking down. There's some pros and some cons, I think, for China. And I mean, on the pro side, China's interests are sort of aligned in the sense of, wanting Russia, if North Korea is helping Russia in its war against the Ukraine, China would rather see Russia, I think, prevail than, and Russia is on sort of China's side in terms of its positioning against maybe the Western hegemonic sort of, bloc in the world. And, Russia also, China also, I think, has an interest in North Korea staying afloat, not collapsing, and maybe even advancing its weapons in the sense of acting as a buffer between, South Korea and, the US forces here. But at the same time, China has, a lot more positions on the board globally than, North Korea and Russia are kind of it's like a partnership of mutual need and interest at this point, whereas China has been cautious in outright supporting Russia. I mean, they've been very, they haven't supplied them directly with weapons or really, and, even in discussing the Russia-North Korea partnership, they haven't kind of outright blessed it. I mean, they've just kind of said it's between the two countries. And, for China, they have to navigate just the whole their economic position in the world. Russia and North Korea are kind of in the pariah position now, whereas China really has to navigate sort of dealing with the rest of the world and, being so economically intertwined, as well as, I don't think China wants to be seen as, the head of this new trilateral military alignment in this region, because then, suddenly you have NATO and perhaps they're called the AP4 here, which is the Western aligned, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, having a greater reason to kind of strengthen their cooperation with NATO, which China doesn't really want to see happen. And, if you have North Korean weapons being used in the Ukraine and perhaps even in Gaza, you're in NATO-related territories now, which gives them a reason to come back. And so I think, China has a lot to sort of lose as well by being too strongly aligned in this. And even President Yoon just mentioned it in a newspaper interview with The Telegraph before his trip to UK, saying that he thinks China has divergent interests with Russia and North Korea, and this would harm its international reputation and standing.
Right. Malene, this next question is something that I discussed with our foreign correspondents last Thursday, I believe. I'm going to extend the same question to you. There is concern within the government here, as well as over in the US, about the possibility of a miscalculated move by North Korea against South Korea, given the turmoil across the world at the moment. Speaking within your capacity as a correspondent based here, what do you believe are the prospects of a Hamas-style attack by North Korea against South Korea?
Well, I think that there is no doubt that countries are inspiring each other. So, of course, North Korea has been aware of this attack by Hamas on Israel. And of course, I think North Korea is also checking out the international statements against Hamas and against Israel as well, because it seems like a big part of, maybe not the governments, but the populations have actually been supporting Palestine in this conflict. And I think that there is no doubt that North Korea has been seeing this. However, I don't really think that these two situations necessarily compare. I don't think that, South Korea and North Korea does not have the same relationship as Israel-Palestine. And also North Korea is not a terrorist group. So I really doubt that North Korea could dream of making this kind of attack, to be honest. And also, North Korea is a member of the UN, just as South Korea. And we all know that if North Korea decided to attack South Korea as another UN member, that would have huge global consequences for North Korea, much huger than they probably have been for Hamas, because Hamas is not a country, it is a terrorist organization. So in a way, they don't need to play by the global rules in the same way that we see North Korea would have to, which has also been pointed out by the US in a statement recently.
And staying with the same question, Thomas, what is your line of thought? Do you believe the possibilities of such an attack is there? And if so, what response measures do you envision from the international community, including South Korea, of course?
Well, I definitely agree with Malene that it doesn't seem a likely prospect. I mean, even from the perspective of what North Korea could possibly seem to gain out of it at this point. I mean, I think the response would undoubtedly be severe. I mean, it would depend, I think, on the nature of the attack. But, South Korea, the U.S., the United Nations Command, which is based here, and its function is to maintain the armistice agreement. And just even last week, there was a meeting with Defense Secretary, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was here, and South Korean defense officials and the representatives of the UNC countries, and they made a statement basically reiterating that they would defend the armistice. I mean, Washington and Seoul have said many times that any nuclear move by North Korea would spell the end of its regime. So I don't know if where the line is for that if they were to try to do that. But I think generally speaking, for all the reasons Malene said, I mean, it's not a real equivalency to compare maybe what North Korea's rationale for an attack like that would be as compared with Hamas. I think the greater concern that observers have is that North Korea clearly is intent on building up its nuclear arsenal more than anything. And some of the reasoning behind that could be that if North Korea can get its nuclear capability to such a state that it becomes a much bigger disincentive for countries to take action against North Korea if it does kind of, provoke any military confrontation. I mean, that could be a context where if the North does actually have plans or a goal sometime to attack the South or try to overthrow the government or attack Seoul, I mean, if it's something where there could be those types of skirmishes and countries would be less inclined to take a strong reaction because of the nuclear threat that North Korea poses. I mean, that's something maybe looking longer term. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, not to say you shouldn't prepare for the possibility of those, of a cross-border attack like that militarily, but it doesn't seem to be really, in the offing at this moment.
And hopefully you're right then. Beyond the Korean Peninsula, Malene, let's turn over to the U.S., where diplomatic engagements on the multilateral level and bilateral level took place in San Francisco. What do you believe, Malene, are some of the viable economic initiatives proposed by President Yoon Suk-yeol at this year's APAC Summit?
Well, President Yoon Suk-yeol made it very clear that he wants to strengthen the economical ties in the region. So he hopes for a closer cooperation with the partners in APEC as well going forward. And I think that is a very wise move made by Yoon Suk-yeol, and it's also clearly very much part of his policy. He's trying to get closer to at least especially Japan, and trying to mend some of the diplomatic problems that there has been, especially during the Moon Jae-in government, where Japan and South Korea was, well, almost literally in a trade war at some point. So I think what Yoon is trying to do is to strengthen especially the ties with Japan, which we also saw at APEC. He was having a summit with Kishida. It was also discussed whether he might have a summit with Xi Jinping. However, that didn't turn out to be. This might, though, also have been good for Yoon Suk-yeol, since, as far as I believe, South Korea is on its way for its first annual trade deficit with China, and it would be the first ever since they started having this trade collaboration, which obviously is not so good for the South Korean economy.
Right. And among the brief or even the longer bilateral interactions that President Yoon was able to have with his global partners, what would you care to highlight, Thomas?
Well, I mean, probably the headline, of course, is another meeting with Kishida. I mean, just kind of demonstrating the growing relationship between Tokyo and Seoul. I think it was their 7th summit this year, which is really in stark contrast to the past. And, there's just a lot of overlapping economic and security issues. And there was also a short trilateral with Biden, Kishida, and Yoon, which is also, that whole relationship is growing quite a lot. I mean, certainly the security-related issues and, other issues. Yoon and Kishida talked about cooperation in the hydrogen sector, and they had a separate meeting after the APEC sideline at a discussion at Stanford. And there's just digital technology stuff, AI, carbon reduction. I mean, they have those kinds of overlapping interests as well. Yoon also did meet with a few other leaders from Vietnam, Peru, Chile. And, those are sort of interesting. Like the Peru, he met with Dina Boluarte, the Peruvian president, and that discussion was about both defense cooperation or defense sales. I mean, South Korea has become a big military supplier, and they want to sell more equipment to Peru, but also about cooperation in the mineral sector. And both Peru and Chile are, huge producers of copper, and Peru is Chile of lithium as well. And those are, major resources for the future of clean and renewable energy. I mean, lithium is used in batteries, copper is used in wiring and all sorts of, components for wind and solar arrays. So, these are important relationships going forward globally. And I mean, Yoon at APEC also kind of made a point of discussing supply chain issues and sort of renewable energy future. So this plays a bit into that. And, it's also, I think we're seeing how South Korea continues to kind of emerge more on a global stage. I mean, obviously it's the alliance with Washington is important, but South Korea also has its own sort of role that it's stepping into, and this is an area that I think we're seeing more of that.
Right, and beyond the various diplomatic initiatives in San Francisco, APAC this year saw its fair share of protesters. Malene, do tell us a bit about their grievances.
Yeah, so there was a lot of different protesters. Some of them were protesting against the Israel-Hamas war. However, I think the more relevant protests for the APEC Summit was global warming, poor working conditions, and corporate profits. Because many of the protesters were arguing that many of the countries that were meeting at APEC in San Francisco were some of the leaders in charge of stopping global warming, but the thought was that they were not really doing enough. So there was a lot of protesters complaining that these world leaders, they should take a bigger stance on climate. And now that they're all meeting together, they actually have the perfect chance to work together to prevent global warming and also to help to get better working conditions. A lot of the countries meeting at the summit were from countries and leaders where the working conditions are not so good and where there is a very huge gap between rich and poor, a lot of inequality. So I think many of the protesters were feeling that there is not done enough to try to stop these social problems and try to prevent social injustice as well as climate injustice.
Right, indeed. They were calling for more action then. Overall, Thomas, how do you assess this year's APAC Summit amid, of course, the conflicts in different parts of the world?
Right. So, they didn't come out with any joint declaration about the Gaza issue or the war in the Ukraine, which I don't think, anyone really expected you could get something like that out of such a diverse group. I mean, I think the big takeaway for most observers was the Biden-Xi summit, which, again, it's not going to repair the sort of Washington-Beijing relationship, but I think just the fact that communication has started again is a relief to a lot of observers. I mean, they, not a lot specific came out of it, but they agreed to reestablish military-to-military communication, which a lot of people were concerned about. They just sort of talked about if I pick up the phone, the other one will answer, and that's, that in itself is important, I think, in this environment where, miscommunication or mishaps could lead to much worse. I mean, there were some domestic things that Biden took away as far as getting China to try to rein in, the production of compounds used to make fentanyl, which is an issue in the U.S. I mean, Biden also mentioned he raised the issue with Xi about trying to get Iran to perhaps, which Beijing has more influence over, to not, to sort of step back and not escalate the situation in Gaza. But I think also we're seeing, and this goes a little bit back to what China's concerns about Russia and North Korea are, China also, I think, Xi was signaling a little bit of a softening or more kind of open for business approach, and he met with a bunch of CEOs when he was there, like Boeing and Apple. So I think China also, we're seeing they have an, you know, China's also going through an economic downturn of its own, so they have an interest in kind of being, you know, into the global economic order as well. So, you know, I think that's probably, and that you know, bleeds over into security issues as well, I think. So I think that's probably the takeaway.
Right, hopefully their economic interests bridging their gap over security concerns then. Malene, how would you evaluate this year's APAC Summit?
Well, I have to agree with Thomas. I think what we really take away from this summit is the Xi-Biden statements and conversations, which I think is a big relief for most people in the world. So yeah, I think also in Denmark that was what was drawing headlines. It was that that the Chinese president would come all the way to San Francisco to shake hands with Biden and to talk, and also that it seems like the relationship between U.S. and China is slowly growing stronger, which I think is a very, very positive thing for, well, most of the citizens all over the world.
Right. Well, both of them have acknowledged that that decoupling is a danger and that they need to be together to ensure that there are no callous consequences on the international arena. All right. Well, on that note, Malene, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts and your time. And Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that ends Monday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That is Tuesday.